Chapter 6 is dealing with estates and interest in land. It does not have to be possessory in estate. One time I told my little son about estates, and we were talking. He was 5 years old. He says, "Pop, that's for people that have a lot of money, estates." And I said, "Wait a minute. Frankie," that's his name. I said, "Frankie, you own your wagon?" And he said, "Yes, Pop." I said, "You have a tricycle?" He says, "Yes, Pop." I said, "That's your estate." Oh, he was so happy. He thought estates were just for wealthy people. Anyway, an estate and interest in land is broken down into two broad categories. A lot of this subject matter, as you know, can be broken down to either 2, 3, or 4 broad categories. Estates and interest in land can be broken down into 2 broad categories: freehold estates and non-freehold estates. Now, I have to admit, I'm a little confined in this room doing this little video, and I do not have my whiteboard. So you have to use your imagination as to what I'll be talking about. But Italians are known to use their hands, as you know, and so I can use my hands once in a while, and you'll be okay. You'll imagine what I'm talking about. Now, estates and interest in land are broken down into 2 broad categories: freehold estates and non-freehold. Let me talk first about a freehold estate. When you guys see the word freehold, I would like you to think of the word ownership. Held for a person's lifetime or more, and that the duration is uncertain. Let me explain again. There are 3 categories of a freehold estate you need to remember. Ownership. A freehold estate means you own the property. Held for a person's lifetime or more, and the duration is uncertain. Let me explain. When you say held for a person's lifetime or more, I'm talking about your being able to pass the estate on to your heirs when you're not here. When I'm mentioning about that it's held for a person's lifetime or more, again, that's held in case we pass, we can pass on our estate to our heirs. The duration is uncertain. You and I don't know how long we're going to own our property. We can own it. We can sell our house 5 months from now, 15 years from now, or 50 years from now. So the duration is uncertain. Well, how is that different than a non-freehold estate? That's a good question. In a non-freehold estate, you want to remember it's non-ownership. Don't forget, freehold, you want to think of the word for ownership. Non-freehold, non-ownership. In a non-freehold estate, you want to think about the word lease or leasehold. Non-ownership. Remember, freehold ownership. The duration is certain. Why? Don't all leases have an expiration date, whether it's 1 year, 14 years, or like in Ocean Grove, 99 years? So all leases, we all know that a lease is going to come to an end. So now let me repeat again. Freehold estates, broken down into 2 broad categories. Freehold estates, estates and interest in land, 2 broad categories. Freehold and non-freehold. Freehold, you want to think of the word ownership. Non-freehold, you want to think of non-ownership. Under freehold, you want to think of held for a person's lifetime or more. The duration is uncertain. Okay? Whereas the other side, you want to think of lease or leasehold. And that does have all leases have an expiration. Now, if you're using the textbook, Essentials of New Jersey Real Estate, on page 74 and 75 in most of the books, there are 2 pages that I rank a 10, and they're dealing with estates and interest in land. You need to know those 2 pages very, very well. A lot of the chapters have more than one subject. For example, chapter 6 has 3 subjects: estates and interest in land, liens, and easements. Right now we're talking about estates and interest in land, those 2 pages that I mentioned. Now, under the category of freehold estate, there are subcategories: fee simple, determinable fee, and let me start again. Fee simple, determinable fee, and a life estate. So just imagine that I had a whiteboard behind me, and underneath freehold, indented a little bit, you have 3 subcategories. The first subcategory is fee simple, The next one underneath that, determinable fee. And the last one, life estate. Let's talk about the first one, fee simple. When you buy timeshare, a condominium, a single family home, when you come out of the lawyer's office, you want to own that property, fee simple. Why? Because that's the highest degree of ownership imagined by law. No one's going to take that property away from you. As long as you pay the taxes, as long as you pay your mortgage, you can put your head on a pillow and sleep nights. Unless they need it by eminent domain or whatever, some other, or it burns or whatever. But overall, that's the best way of owning real estate. Isn't that the only way? No. You can own real estate wherein if you don't do what you're supposed to do, the giver can get it back. For example, in a deed, if you buy a property from a religious organization, may be a stipulation that if you ever bring alcoholic beverages on the lot that they're selling to you, they can get the property back. So on a hot July day, when you're watching the Mets lose again, and you wanted to take a cold one, watch out, because they may be watching you from the window, and if you take that cold one, you could lose that property after owning it about 12 years. So now you get the point. All real estate, you can't just put your head on a pillow, and just because you have a deed, that's the end of the ballgame. That's not true. That's why attorneys review the deed to see if there are any stipulations, any restrictions. You could own the property where the seller in the deed says, I'm selling you this property with the understanding that you're going to use it for educational purposes. If you use that property for non-educational purposes, that seller, 8 years, 12 years, 19 years, can get the property back. So obviously it's not as good as fee simple, because if it was fee simple, no one's taking it back from you. That's determinable fee. So fee simple, the best way to own real estate. Determinable fee, the second way. How about the third way? A life estate. A life estate is given to a person for the rest of his or her life. Lorraine has a son, Paul. He's a wonderful kid. The sister loves him very much, but the brother's not going anywhere. Yet he's handy. Does a little electrical work, plumbing work. He's a handy guy. Single. Stephen, her husband, and she own a second home in the Adirondacks in Lake George. And Lorraine says to her brother, if he's interested, she'll give the vacation home to her brother. The way he does work here in New Jersey, up in New York State, he can get more work. He can winterize the home that's used now seasonally. And more importantly, Lorraine, his sister, says, I'll give you the deed of the property. If Paul says yes, in a life estate, it's given to a person for the rest of his or her life. If her brother takes the deed at the closing, he owns the property. However, when he dies, Lorraine, his sister, is going to get the property back. All right? And if she predeceases Paul, her heirs get the property back. So let me repeat. A life estate is given to a person for the rest of his or her life. When they pass away, the property goes back to the giver. It's almost acting like a lease. Doesn't the landlord get the property back when the lease expires? Yes. Well, the only difference is, in a lease, it's non-ownership. I'm sitting here talking about ownership. The person who has a life estate owns that property. Okay? And of course, the sister's going to go to her attorney to draw up proper documents. Paul is going to have to cut the lawn, pay the taxes, keep the property in a good state of repair, because the sister eventually is going to get the house back. Now, if she predeceases her brother, again, let me repeat, if he's single, if he gets married, his wife doesn't get the property when he dies. Everything is predicated on his life. And remember, the giver, what I'm explaining now, by the way, in your textbook is called the life estate and reversion, coming from the root word to revert, to come back. All right? Now, let's suppose that the next day Lorraine says to her brother, I went to my attorney and there's one small change. And the small change is, Stephen, her husband, and I, we don't want the property back when you die. Now, the reason why our attorney said it, we may be in a tax bracket that could hurt us. And so, therefore, when you pass away, we don't want the property back. It's going to go to Johnny. Now, Johnny is her son, his nephew. Is that legal? Yes. So when a person sets up a life estate, they either can get it back when the holder dies, or they can give it to someone else. In your textbook, that's called the life estate and remainder. If the property goes back to the giver, that's called the life estate and reversion, coming from the root word to revert, to come back. If it goes to a third party, that's called the life estate and remainder. And that third party, Johnny, that little boy that I talked about, is called, in a test question, the remainder person. All right? Now, life estates can be given to one person based on the life of another. For example, Let's say you get along fantastically well with your mother-in-law, but for your father-in-law, if your religion allowed for it, you would hate that man. But you don't allow for that. Now, the problem is you have two homes. You would love your mother-in-law to live out her life in the one home that you don't use. The problem is she has Alzheimer's disease. You cannot give her a life estate because you cannot contract with her. However, that guy that you can't stand, your father-in-law, he, as bad as he is personally, he has control of his mental faculties. So legally, you can give a life estate to your father-in-law, but you can base it on the life of your mother-in-law. When she dies, he's out of there. Now, in your textbook, that's called a life estate autrevie, which is a French term which means autrevie, which is a French term which means for the life of another. Now, let's suppose you do get along with your father-in-law and your mother-in-law, okay? Well, then you could give a life estate to both of them, and the second to die has to leave. So if your mother-in-law predeceases your father-in-law, he can stay in there if you gave them a life estate. When he passes away, then you get the estate back. So now let me repeat again. Life estate is given to a person for the rest of his or her life. When that person, by the way, in a test question, that person is referred to as the life tenant or the holder of a life estate, which could be confusing because the word tenant indicates something temporary, like a tenant in a lease. But I'm standing here talking about ownership. Don't confuse, it's a freehold estate. A life estate is on the left side, freehold ownership. Don't confuse it with non-ownership, even though it's behaving like non-ownership. Don't confuse it. Now, a life estate can be given to more than one person. Also, if you get a question, life estates can be created when we're living, and life estates can be created when we're not living. For example, each and every one of you, after you get out of class today, can go to your attorneys and say, I own two homes. I have a sister that's very close to me. She and my brother-in-law, I want them to have this house. You could do it today. You could set up a life estate with an extra house you have. And incidentally, if you wonder why people do this, sometimes for estate planning reasons, to lower their estate and leave more to their heirs and loved ones and less to the IRS and for probate costs. So sometimes they sit with their attorneys and utilize what I'm talking about today for estate, which I'm not an attorney. I'm not about ready to talk about estate planning. I'm just giving you an idea that that's why it's used sometimes. Now, there are two things that, as a matter of fact, let me back off a little bit. Paul, the brother, under a life estate, can do almost anything and everything someone else that owns real estate can do. For example, Paul can use the property in a life estate to encumber it if he needs money to fix the house up. For collateral, the banks are going to want to know what he has as collateral. He can use, even though he has a life estate, and when he dies, he's going to lose the property. Everything's predicated on his life. He can lease the property to others. He can even sell it. Now you're sitting here saying, who in the world is going to do a title search on the property that Paul owns, finding out that when he dies, they're going to lose the property. Not too many people are going to buy that property. However, maybe they can have life insurance on Paul's life. And when he dies, they're going to lose the house, but they can get a check by Prudential, MetLife, or one of the life insurance companies. So it can be done, or it may be commercial property. And if Paul lives 5 years, even though they're going to lose the house, well, everything is predicated on Paul's life. All right? Now, I said that he can encumber it, he can lease it, he can even sell it. There's two things to wind up this chapter that Paul cannot do. And here are the two things. He cannot commit waste, which means he cannot put environmental toxic material all around the property. He can't let the roof wear out. The sister's going to want the house back someday, whether it's 12 years, 18 years. As a matter of fact, the sister, when she sits with her attorney, is going to get a proviso in that agreement where the sister can go back or have her representative go back to the house to make sure that it's whole after 6 months, every year, whatever, because she's going to get the property someday back, or her heirs are going to get it back. So she's not going to let her brother do what he wants to do with that property. Now, the two things he cannot do, he cannot commit waste, and he cannot will the property. And even if he put it in his will, the will not stand up in court, because this type of an arrangement is set up that upon the death of the life tenant, the holder of a life estate, upon his or her death, the property automatically goes back to the giver. I hope this portion of chapter 6 has helped you. The balance of chapter 6 is based on liens and easements, which I'll cover at another time.